can we just start off by me asking you to describe the task that you are responsible for at Humber?
Sure. So I work as the Dean of Students, which is an interesting title because it doesn't really describe anything specific. But I think the broad title is comes with the territory of it is a very broad portfolio. So my specific responsibilities are in the most easy to define would be athletics and recreation as a department that reports up through me, and then all of the student wellness and kind of equitable learning area. So that's counseling and the medical health and medical center. It's the Office of Student Conduct. It's residence life. It's accessible learning services and testing services. And then student case or student care, which is a lot of sort of one-to-one personal contact and helping and supporting students. And then the last big part of the portfolio, which is changing and evolving, is our transition and academic support area. So that is the Math and Writing Center and peer-assisted learning supports. It's orientation, student life and student events, the student equity hubs, and as well as student leadership, co-curricular record. And then a large part of that portfolio is academic advising and academic and career advising. And that's a large section of the portfolio. And then in September, we're expanding to include community employment services, which are 5 community-based employment centers that actually exist off of campus or off the campuses and support employment for community members, so non-student learners looking for work. So that's being added into the portfolio as well.
Wow, that is a very broad task for your role at Humber. So do you mind diving into the career choices that have led you to your role today, like your work history or your volunteer history?
Sure. I would say, so I think everything for me started very early. So I was probably hyper involved in kind of the K to 12, specifically high school, an athlete, in band, on student council, just as involved as I possibly could be. And then when I went away to university to do my undergrad, which is in business administration, the first few years I didn't get all that involved on my university campus because I thought that there would be, so I thought the work was going to be hard, and and I didn't want to commit to anything beyond the classroom. But what I found in that time, right, was that actually my academics probably suffered a little bit more because I wasn't involved in anything. And so, yeah, then I got involved in, I volunteered at the Career Center for a year. And then I got involved in housing and residence life as a residence, we call them residence life dons or residence advisors or assistants, depending on which school. At Humber, we call them RAs. And also worked for the Students' Union at the campus pub. So I did that for years 4 and 5 of my undergrad, which that paved the way to getting to me working in post-secondary, which I've done since then. So I started off at the University of Windsor in a live-in residence life role, and I worked at the University of Windsor for 4 years, and then moved to York University in a residence life role and worked in residence life and student life at York for the better part of 5 years. And then I got a position downtown at Ryerson University and was there for the better part of 6 years, working in both student life and then housing and residence life. And then finally, in my final year, I did some interim, I fulfilled an interim role as the vice provost students at Ryerson. And then on to Humber. So I've been at Humber for about almost 2.5 years now.
Yeah.
In my current role. So that's, I would say, so what I would say on the work history side and the volunteer history side, and specifically connecting in with kind of what led me to the space today, what I learned
Yeah.
in terms of getting involved in residence and specifically working in residence was I learned a fair amount about the privilege that I grew up with in rural kind of Ontario. With parents who had both had advanced degrees, both were school teachers, so middle class upbringing, and started to learn a lot more about kind of the advantages that were afforded to me based on the privilege of my skin color and the fact that I'm male, that I'm a straight male. And I really didn't get exposed to any of that until probably third or fourth year university. And when I started to get exposed to that, I wanted to do something different. And it happened to kind of correspond with a time where I realized that working in business was not going to provide me with that fulfillment, at least not in the traditional way that I had thought working for a bank or work, right? Like it just didn't, it didn't seem like I was going to get there. So that was what kind of led me to wanting to do this. And in the time period, I've done some things like volunteer with Big Brothers and Big Sisters, and did some tutoring for the Children's Aid Society for a few years. And I think, one of the things that's connected to this, this conversation around sustainability and this conversation about my work is about improving things for the next generation.
Yes.
And thinking about what the generation before, thinking about what my, grandparents and my parents had, and about the decisions that were made, and were those the best decisions or were they not? And then what am I going to leave my children, and what are my children's children going to inherit? And more importantly, thinking about that doesn't just mean environmental sustainability. It means things connected to human rights. It means things connected to equity and inclusion, about betterment for everybody.
Right. Yes.
Through equity. So yeah, that's kind of what led me to where I am.
Right. I mean, you just tied into my next question, which I think you've answered perfectly, which is how do you address sustainability in what you do? And I think even your realization that that you had, in your last years of university, that you want to do something that can help preserve the next generations, and that you want to find a career that fulfills you to do work like that, I think is great. And that definitely touches on sustainability. So my next question would be, and it's a bit of a big one, but take your time, no worries, is why is sustainability important to you?
I have so this isn't a surprise to those that I've spoken to or who know me. I have twin 9-year-old boys, but I think I'd been thinking about this before I was a parent. I go to that space of like, you don't need to have a direct link to the future generations to want something better for the current and for the planet moving forward. I think for a long time there was there's a recognition that we could only do, or that there was an idea or a concept that we could only do so much. But when you see the world around you change, and as I mentioned, I grew up in rural Ontario, so growing up, I did all kinds of different work. I worked on a farm for the summers. I worked on a ski hill in the winters. Just jobs all through high school and kind of through university. And the change in what is happening when we think about the climate, and what I was working in 20-something years ago in the month of August, and how different that is now. And then I think about, another example is a ski hill in Southern Ontario, which has become, went from being probably a 3 or 4 month a year operation to now really a 2 month a year operation. You start to see it on a micro level, right? And I think, that in some ways awakened me to what's happening. I think the other thing is, I truly think that we can't kind of ignore what's been going on around us. And this is I think the hard part is, the connection of why is sustainability important to me, and what impact can I make, connected to the broader system, which in some ways makes that so incredibly challenging to do, right? There are individual decisions that I can make, but they have, like, on the scale that we need to make change, they have minimal impact. I'm still going to make those decisions, right? But what we need to see is big change and big impact. And I think that's why when you're in leadership roles and you're in education, your job is in many ways to educate and support the building of knowledge and awareness so that those big changes can happen, so that there is enough of an interest in making change, that we start to demand more of industry, we start to demand more of our governments, we start to see our leaders graduate and become those decision makers.
Right, I agree.
Right, so that's all of that kind of, right, there's a personal stake in it for me, which is I want to see things better for my boys, and that's a scary thing sometimes. But the other side of it too is just, like, there is so much we could do, and just kind of, you witness the change that's happening and you think, oh,
yeah.
Right. That sounded very hopeless. It's not all hopeless.
No, definitely not. There's definitely an internal component and an external component as well. So you did mention previously that you do volunteer with, or you did, I'm not sure if you continue to, social causes off campus. Do you, like the Big Brothers and Big Sisters, do you still volunteer at any other social causes off campus or even environmental causes as well?
It's been a few years since I have, and in some ways it's me, and it's not me being selfish. It's me trying to find a way to prioritize the big commitment that is this job and family. So rather than formal involvement, it probably looks more like informal involvement these days.
Right.
Just connections to causes. Being an active voice in the community when things are, so for example, when a developer is going to change land use in a space, involved in those conversations. Being an active advocate for active transportation, both kind of in my local community, but connected to the places that I've worked, has been a big part of my part of the last few years for me. I'm an avid cyclist, and seeing ways to do that and make that more sustainable and safer for folks is a big part of what I'm interested in. And thinking about kind of the, sort of the bigger issues and the bigger challenges that we face in terms of moving people around is one aspect of sustainability and environmentalism, but it's not the only aspect. And so, thinking about those other pieces. So in the last little while, I would describe it as more informal, but being involved in the conversation, attending last year and a bit, it's been virtual meetings to advocate things, make sure that my voice is heard in some of those community consultations, and that's a big part of it.
Yeah, those informal aspects are equally as important as well. So my next question would be, what advice do you have for someone who is interested in getting involved with the environmental or social projects like you have described, but doesn't know where to begin? Like, what would you say to a student?
Ooh. So I think one is, one is take a chance. I will say that. And it may start with something small. The reason that I highlight that is, my involvement in community started with a small volunteer job that was 3 hours a week, and I didn't get paid, and it was just like I came in and I helped with some stuff. But that connected me to bigger conversations and bigger opportunities. So I think some of it is that. I think some of it is acknowledging and recognizing that you bring something to the table. You bring a talent to the table, you bring an energy to the table, and that could look very different for you than it does for me. And so there are ways to be involved in ways that will maximize your talent and will help you achieve the fulfillment you're looking for. And they don't all have to be active, sort of at the front of the room kind of scenarios or leading kind of a large group. It can be just in the group, or it can be involvement in conversations. And I think, one of the things that I would say is look for mentors and people that you feel are working in spaces that you want to work in and that you want to be involved in, and recognize that by building a connection, they can point you in directions within either their industry or in other spaces and give you ideas about how they landed where they did,
Right.
and what might work for you. That would be my advice for kind of anybody looking to get involved. And as I said, that a foot in the door and a small start can lead to really big things, right? And opportunities. So
I totally agree.
Yeah.
So is there anything else that you would like to add at this time? I think you've given us great information, great knowledge to walk away with, to learn about sustainability, and you've touched on even your journey from before college or university to now. I think they all connect. And is there anything else that you'd like to say to the students watching today?
Ooh, I think I guess the only thing I would add is that there's plenty of opportunity out there. I think one of the things that I hope changes over a period of time is that there's an acknowledgement and an understanding that the only future is a sustainable future, and that there's opportunity that comes with that, and acknowledging that exists. And I think the other part that I'd add, when we have these conversations, is our conversations about what. So as students and as folks that want to get involved in this conversation moving forward, to contemplate who's been left out of conversations around sustainability and what we privilege, what voices we privilege at that table, right? So we privilege like electric car manufacturers as an example, but we don't talk about how Indigenous people have been living in this land sustainably for generations upon generations upon generations. So how do we in a future us start to think about finding ways to ensure that those voices are a part of this conversation, that it isn't a colonized version of sustainability that fits our narrative in terms of it being profitable, but really does start to see that the true profitability is that we'll have a planet to live on, in the future.
Yes, thank you so much. This concludes our interview. And again, on the behalf of the Office of Sustainability and Humber's community, I'd like to thank you for giving us your time to highlight your sustainability initiatives.
Awesome. Thanks, Priscilla.
No problem.